In the meantime, this establishment, this party that we have, the single party state, this fraternity that runs this country, that has two chapters, a Republican and a Democrat, one a little bit more liberal than the other one more conservative, representing the big business interests more directly. That's the Republicans. In terms of their interests, that's the A team. But they always have the B team that they can run out. A Jimmy Carter when Richard Nixon makes the nation too angry, or the nation gets too riled at the Vietnam War or something like that. This is where they produced Michael Dukakis. But then they realized they did not have to go with the B team. The people didn't care. They didn't have to give the nation a B team. So they went ahead and went with the A team, which was George Bush, i.e. they concluded eventually that they could Teflonize Bush despite all of this incredible activity and sell him to the nation, and they did.
Former CIA official John Stockwell provides his analysis of the recent presidential elections. You'll hear a perspective which you won't find on the regular media, and it's going to happen right now on Alternative Views.
Hello, welcome to Alternative Views. We're very happy to have John Stockwell with us to discuss the implications of the election to the presidency of George Bush. We'll be discussing that with John today. John is a peace activist, a writer, a lecturer, an ex-CIA agent, and now a prominent critic of the CIA, who currently is working on two books, one on the Vietnam War and another on the arms race. He's also been commissioned by Oliver Stone to write a screenplay about Central America and has been very busy lecturing, traveling around the country, and doing research since we last saw him on Alternative Views. So welcome back, John.
My pleasure.
And it looks like our crew didn't show up, so I'm going to have to do a camera, be a camera operator for all three cameras as well as participate in this.
Okay, well jump in whenever you feel like it.
Man of
Frank.
many talents.
Right.
This is like in the old days.
So, John, I think everyone is concerned about what the election of George Bush will mean for American foreign and domestic policy and what a Bush presidency would be like. We're currently in the period, the honeymoon period, where all the media are just celebrating him, being nice to him, all the politicians are snookering up to him. So let's give a critical perspective on the Bush presidency that we really haven't heard from our corrupt mainstream media.
It's a tough one. This is, of course, the calm before the storm, perhaps. We have so little to go on. The man's been a vice president, politician. The responsible people say, give him a break, let's wait and see what he does. My own position, and then they say, well, he is such a chameleon, but he could go either way, so to speak. And they point out that he was historically more moderate than Reagan, who has always had a wild hair up his nose. But I personally am more of the school that I believe we do know a lot about this man. In fact, we know some things about him that are much more significant and frightening than what we knew about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was, of course, a committed conservative who was known to have a slightly defective mind. Who
and
had some
proved that was the case.
And proved it and lived up to, and had some harsh policies when he was governor of California. But Bush, this CIA directorship where he made these contacts, I worked for him. You know, I witnessed personally his supervising the CIA's covering up of illegal activity at the end of the Angola operation in early 1976. and he was actually fending off the hostile Congress. Instead of investigating and firing the perpetrators of crimes, he was fending off the FBI and the Congress on at least 3 or 4 major CIA criminal activities.
What were those activities?
Well, one was the Angolan operation, where we had broken a number of laws, much like the Iran-Contra and the Bolan kind of laws. And then we had conspired to cover up the breaking of the laws. And I mean literally, we sat around the big oak tables and discussed the law. We went down to the library and read up on the law. And then things like, I remember one session reminding the boss, you know, don't contradict yourself. Or last week you said, you know, don't contradict yourself. This week, if Senator so-and-so brings up a certain issue. And this one, he just plowed right into that one. And he was just telling the Senate, you know, the Congress, I don't know, I wasn't here, but I'm sure that I just find it very difficult to believe, but we'll look into it thoroughly. If you'll just give me some slack. And he was reassuring them. And with you know, him patting him on the head, they backed off and just never got back to it. He was also doing the same thing about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, which was being investigated in that cycle, and also the Chilean operation, the killing of, you know, the Track 1, Track 2 ouster and killing of Salvador Allende in Chile, and he was fending off an investigation of that. In the FBI stuff, the Justice Department was investigating some of the mercenaries who had been involved in the CIA's Angola program. And they were asking us specifically which ones had worked for us and in what capacities. And a young attorney showed up from the General Counsel's office responding to Bush's supervision policies, and actually went through my files and purged documents that he thought would be legally incriminating if we were subpoenaed, you know, if we were investigated. And all of that was a thorough indication of Bush's policies as I witnessed them. Beyond that, we have an incredible record that we'll get into in greater depth as we chat here now of the connections that he picked up when he was CIA director. So we have not only Noriega, but we have a dozen or dozens of Noriegas who have blackmail control of this man. Now, one would like to give anyone the benefit of the doubt and say, hopefully they're going to be more moderate, but this man even wished he to be more moderate on CIA activities, would have an uphill fight, because that establishment has got so much dirt on him. And I personally don't believe he really has any desire or instincts to withdraw from them. I think he sees a secret world that goes back to that skull and bones thing at Yale, that kind of secret elite manipulation, the Knights of Malta. I think psychologically he's just deeply committed to a view of the world where there's elite insiders who are well above the normal laws of man and God.
You look at see who's been the head of the CIA all these years, and it's been people who've been right up at the top and interlocked with the top people in the American power structure. It seems that that's such an important part, running an intelligence service, that the establishment people don't want any outsiders doing it.
Well, what is the implication then of having an ex-CIA director, the President of the United States? This is the first time that this has ever happened, that someone who is so deeply involved in intelligence activities is actually the President.
Well, it's a giant step towards the national security state is what it is. It's a huge victory for the national security establishment. And always remember that although it goes far beyond the CIA, but the CIA was created in the National Security Act of 1947. And the national security establishment has the CIA as one of the inner chapters, so to speak. And to have one of its directors bought into the thing totally and controlled by all of the illegal activities that he's been privy to and part of, it means just that. We've been watching and worrying, and people have been writing books for 15 years about the national security state. And this is a giant step in that direction, is what it amounts to.
So does that mean that the CIA will have much more influence in current policy than they would have otherwise, and that Bush has this mentality, the sort of conspiratorial, covert action, interventionist view of the world that these people have? How do you think that might translate practically into an increased role for the CIA? Or increased influence on Bush?
You get into some nuances, or personalities, if you will. Overall, the establishment that the CIA represents is much stronger, having Bush as president. However, it's difficult to imagine the CIA being more dominant and active than it was under William Casey, for the simple reason that the man was wild, Wild Bill Casey.
Right.
And he was running poorly thought out, very aggressive operations in every corner of the world. Now, Bush has decided to go with William Webster. Now, Webster is no saint.
As the head of the CIA.
As the head of the CIA, which means...
Right.
Yes, which means the head of the intelligence community, because the CIA director coordinates all of the intelligence in the 7 bureaucracies. Webster is no saint. It's not that that it makes you feel reassured. In fact, he ran COINTELPRO 2 in the FBI under Reagan when they were harassing the people who were supporting or lobbying against the Contras. And but what's the most ominous thing about this man is that the establishment exonerated him totally. He was permitted by the Congress, by the establishment, by the Washington Post media, at the end of that thing, when it was exposed, of taking the idiots out, the stupidity out, the moron out, of saying, well, it's true I was director of the FBI, but I wasn't aware of any of these activities. And, the Admiral's ship sinks, and he said, well, I wasn't aware it had a hole in the side.
This sounds like a Ronald Reagan deficient management style, or simply lying.
And Bush used the same out. He sat in 17 meetings of the National Security Council in which they discussed the Iran-Contra scandal, and he says he doesn't remember their ever having talked about it.
There was also another interesting thing that he said when they asked him about Oliver North on one of the TV things. He said, well, they made 2 or 3 mistakes. The fact that it was all illegal never even fazed him. It didn't make any difference.
Back to Webster, though, it's interesting to note that 2 levels of the intelligence or national security establishment, not the community, the hard, the paid professionals, the on-duty professionals, but the community has spoken out at 2 levels. One, at the Henry Kissinger level, they've gotten together and published a paper in which they have spelled out policies that Bush should follow, which speak pretty openly of brutality towards the Third World. And then at a level below that, the Georgetown professors, where McFarlane went to work after he left the White House, where Ray Klein and others operate from, where they publish these books, the intelligence requirements for the 80s, and now they've come out for the 90s. These people, Robert Gates, the former deputy director, these people have come out with publications and statements and radio interviews and whatnot, vigorously protesting Webster as CIA director because they say he is soft on covert action. He's not aggressive enough.
Yet we know that Bush is such a believer in covert action that at least it's unlikely there'll be that much of a curtailing of covert action.
Well, we're getting into nuances. They're going to run operations, for sure. It's a question of how many and how wild. And then at a certain point, you see, it's almost in the world's interest. God knows this is a perverse kind of logic, but it's almost in the world's interest to have a William Casey as opposed to William Webster, because Casey would go so far that he would self-destruct.
Right.
He was truly crazy, wild. And so these things would be exposed, and there would be a reaction. The Congress would clash with him endlessly. He would mining the harbors and lie about it. Whereas Webster is muting it with the Congress and building good relations, and by having a little bit better judgment, he may actually accomplish more in the long run, and it may be harder for us to crack it open.
John, could you go into some more detail on this blackmail theme of how Bush might be subject to blackmail because of his involvement in the CIA and in other activities during the Reagan administration? What would be an example of this, and how would such blackmail work?
Well, let's go into the most obvious case that we know of, the one that we have the best documented so far. And this is this Black Eagle thing that was started in '82. Essentially, in a reversal of roles, the CIA is actually created to give the White House and the executive plausible deniability, so they can keep clean, and if the CIA does something wrong, they can, well, we didn't know about it, and they can fire the CIA's director. William Casey reversed this policy, and it was actually quite clever in retrospect in the Iran-Contra thing. He initiated the Iran-Contra thing, but he managed to have Ronald Reagan and the White House take the heat for it. He ran it through Oliver North. So it became a political thing, whereas the CIA was clearly under the thumb of the Congress, or should have been, or legally was. But he also, this Black Eagle operation of delivering arms to the Contras, he got George Bush to front for that, to use the vice president's office to front for that. And Bush was a very activist vice president, running this thing they had on anti-terrorism, supposedly, which is, of course, 1984 doublespeak for, running terrorist activities, smuggling arms. And through that operation, they began to work through Panama, and the planes flying through Panama, and Noriega gave them access to the airstrips that they needed, and immediately began working at the other end of the line through the Medellin, using the same Black Eagle planes to fly drugs up here into the United States. And Bush his office was running this thing. Now, obviously, they tried to maintain what I thought was a very thin, implausible deniability of having Don Gregg running the thing right out of George Bush's office with his assistant, what's his name, Samuel Watson, and then Felix Rodriguez down in El Salvador, and then a network that went throughout, planes flying throughout, Southern Air Transport involved, their own airplanes involved, and yet the only deniability was Gregg saying, well, I never told the vice president about all of these things, which is utterly impossible. It is not within the realm of human, unless the person were a Ronald Reagan. And even then, he would have had to have known what Gregg was doing.
Can you give us a little background on Gregg, the fact that he and Bush had been together in the CIA and buddies for a long time?
Yeah, Gregg was not an original. I think he came into the CIA in '51, a graduate of Williams College. At the height, that was getting into the McCarthy era, the height of conservatism, the Korean War, a very, very conservative era. And he joined and had what was ultimately tremendously successful career. In fact, I thought that Bush would wind up appointing him as a CIA director, and instead he's gone with William Webster. The guy had to do with the destabilization of Cuba in the '60s. He wound up in Vietnam in Military Region 3 in 1970, and that's where I was, except I didn't overlap with him. But I got there just after he had left, so there were a lot of people were talking about him and about Felix Rodriguez,
who was one of his favorite operatives in Vietnam.
In the height of the Phoenix program.
And Shackley was his boss, wasn't he?
And Shackley was the boss.
So you see the same group moving in with George Bush then in the basement of the White House, right next door to Oliver North.
Minus Shackley.
Shackley wasn't.
Yeah, minus Shackley, who had been squeezed out by then.
But Shackley was still in operation, involved in a lot of these things.
Well, I'm sure the old boy thing worked so that he was in contact with them, but don't ever forget that these people fight a lot. They are as bad as people in the peace movement about squabbling, literally. You remember when Black Eagle eventually fell apart, and then the enterprise kind of came apart. Oliver North and Felix Rodriguez were at each other's throats. And these are two very volatile, unstable, dangerous men who couldn't get along. You remember the incident that's cited in the Foreign Policy Fall 88 issue that broke Black Eagle was when the CIA operatives, it doesn't name them, and the Israeli operatives drew their pistols on each other.
This was 1985.
85.
Wow.
And they were about to start blasting each other away, and the senior head said, everybody cool it, just, slow down, and prevailed and got everybody to put their guns back. And at the same time, the Pollard case was breaking, and the U.S. was going to prosecute the Pollards, and Israel didn't appreciate that, so it
Who had
withdrew
been
its support
spying for Israel and
against the United States.
Right. And
Can
And
you clarify something for me, or are you through with it? What you?
No, there's so much of this material. Yeah.
I'm a bit confused now. Oliver North's office was next door to George Bush and Donald Gregg's in the bottom of the White House, as I understand it. Now, were they working together, or as I've heard some people say, they actually had two separate arms running and drug smuggling operations going? Or were they separate but coordinated?
Well, they have done everything they could to obfuscate, if you will, and confuse the issue. North admitted that he met with Bush on many occasions, but he minimized the cooperation. The way I see it is there were a number of different offices, and people did have different roles to play, and there were different power lines working. And don't ever forget that there is just a norm of every presidency since I've been around anyway, is a lot of intense competitiveness. I mean, they're really ruthless. Everybody's jockeying for position endlessly inside the White House and the Vice President's office, if he has any power. So North was definitely part of the same machinery. He was definitely cooperating with George Bush as Bush was cooperating with Casey. But at the same time, North was definitely beating his own drum and tooting his own horn and flying around the world grandstanding and setting his... They were not it was not a disciplined unit like one CIA office would be, or one Marine division would be, or one of your Navy ships would be. And these are a lot of competing people who are in the same ideology, the same administration, and moving in the same direction, with the same evil intentions.
The way that the Rolling Stone told this story in their November 3rd essay on the dirty secrets of George Bush, the Black Eagle operation that Bush, Rodriguez, and Gregg were running was coming apart because of this rupture with the Israelis, and also because they found out Noriega was running so many drugs that this was threatening the integrity of the operation. So North began this other enterprise, literally called the Enterprise, with Richard Secord and Hakeem and these people to bring arms down to the Contras. But Secord had trouble getting it off, so that Felix Rodriguez began another operation, and once Secord got his going, they shut down the operation with Rodriguez's Cuban friends, who had lost a lot of money in this and were very angry, and this began the tension between Rodriguez and Bush and the Secord North group, and eventually the tensions there sort of exploded, and Bush was the guy supposedly trying to hold everything together. That when these other guys, North and Rodriguez, were at each other's throats, Bush was the guy that had to smooth things over. So again, he played a major role in carrying out these operations, according at least to these this Rolling Stone story that seemed fairly well documented.
No, I endorse it. The way you describe it is the way I have read it myself very much. That in fact, the original outfit, they had built this giant warehouse called the Arms Supermarket and stocked it with arms which are supposed to be bought by the Contras with the U.S. taxpayers' dollars or the private enterprise dollars. And at the time that North pulled away from that enterprise to start the enterprise, they had that thing stocked with $18 million worth of arms. Now, arms is a cash-for business, and this cash had to come from the Medellin Colombian cocaine cartel.
Right.
So there was drug money that they had been working with that had stocked this warehouse, counting on selling the arms to the enterprise small e, and then North did break away at the point where he saw that thing apparently as getting out of control, as being too explosive. Now, it was not. Don't anyone misunderstand that he was morally troubled by working with people who were smuggling drugs. He had known for years these people were smuggling drugs. But as you noted, the volume of it was getting so high that he saw an earthquake coming and actually moved. There also was undoubtedly part of his ego, power play, power struggle at the level of him and Rodriguez, at the level perhaps of him and Gregg.
During this whole time, George Bush was supervisor. He was control of the anti-drug program in the United States, not just the propaganda bit, you know, just say no, but a great and very expensive operation to interdict drugs and to keep them from coming into the United States. So it was a perfect circle, not only from the propaganda point of view, because Bush could be said to be the guy who was keeping it from coming in, but on the covert aspect, he could make sure that this stuff came in undetected.
And yet, none of these stories came out during the election campaign. When I left for Europe on August the 17th, during the Republican convention, Dukakis was 10 or 15 points ahead. Bush had just nominated chosen Quayle, as vice president. That looked like it was going to be a self-destruct operation. And when I came back a month later, Bush was 10 points ahead. What do you make of this? How do you analyze Bush's turning things around and winning the presidency? What was involved in this?
Well, one just quick observation is there's some false polling in the summer. After the Democratic convention, the Democrats always look better. They've gotten a lot of publicity. And then a month later, after the Republican convention, they have a surge back. And so it's sometime about the 1st of September where the polls, I think, I forget the figure, but it's something like 9 times out of 10, the one who is leading on the 1st of September wins. So it's stabilized by the end of August. And in fact, by the end of August, Bush was ahead again. The Quayle thing was a heavy hit of Bush. One might call it a major blunder, but since he succeeded, we all reflected on that a lot. His choice of Quayle, as I see it, was twofold. He had to pick someone who would make him look like a giant. And that was not easy to do. If he picked Bob Dole, for example, someone who knew more and had a stronger personality, he would have all kinds of problems. He also, in my opinion, and this is an analyst's opinion, you know, this is not based on any hard quotes or anything, very subjective, but he also had to pick someone who was bought into the Iran-Contra scandal. And Quayle was. He was the senator from Indiana, and Indiana's the state that John Hull, you know, came from, who was the man who had the ranch in Costa Rica from which all the drug smuggling and the arms, you know, from the southern side of the Contra thing had been run. And it turns out, as we dug up in August and found out, this young man working for Quayle introduced Hull to Oliver North originally, and that young man's name was Robert Owens.
And so was involved in all this?
Owens was working for Quayle when he introduced John Hull. Oh yes, when he introduced John Hull to Oliver North and gave them that whole option, which evolved into the enterprise and the whole scandal.
That's incredible. The whole interconnections, all of this, even Quayle. I mean, this is amazing.
To go back, this is a very complicated thing, but I think we can sort it out. I don't think Bush dared to have someone in office who was clean of the Iran-Contra thing, like Dole, who could benefit from an impeachment.
So he needed someone that would be tainted enough with the Iran-Contra that they would be forced to resign at the same time.
They would be impeached with him, who could not possibly benefit from his impeachment. He needed to create a situation
to protect himself,
where the establishment couldn't shunt him aside and put in a strong figure like Dole or Howard Baker, who would be very acceptable to the public and to the establishment.
Right.
And that's where Quayle came. And that Barbara Honegger, who is not the world's greatest analyst, but she certainly has a lot of fire and imagination, and she coined the phrase that he was, Quayle was Bush's impeachment insurance.